My name is Erin Parker, and my dissertation is entitled The Following Story May Be Propaganda: The Christian Century and the Holocaust. My research questions don't differ much from what other scholars, other Holocaust historians have asked as they have engaged with the American media. These historians include Deborah Lipstadt and Robert Ross, Laurel Leff. So, my questions are: what and how did the Christian Century report about the persecution and annihilation of the Jews from 1933 to 1947? Why did the editors make certain editorial decisions concerning the information coming from Europe about the Jews? And what impact might this reporting have had on readers and or other publications that looked to the Christian Century for their own editorial decisions? Before I get into the importance of those research questions, there are some terms that really might be helpful to define. One is mainline, the Protestant mainline. Typically, historians, when talking about the Protestant mainline, are referencing what are known as the Seven Sisters of large, white Protestant churches with liberal theology, mostly found in the North. These churches included the Protestant Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church USA, the Northern Baptist Convention, the Congregational Christian Church, the United Methodist Church, the United Lutheran Church, and the Disciples of Christ. Now, the term mainline is used somewhat anachronistically because the term was not coined until the early 1960s, but it is a term that historians commonly use when referencing these specific churches, no matter where on the timeline of history they fall. The significance of the mainline church is that they had a sizable congregation, but really they were just influential. About 18 to 20% of adults over the age of 13 belonged to the mainline churches, the Seven Sisters. That's about 16,652,951 members. Most scholars agree that the main line, however, held a disproportionate amount of political and social power. They were very influential in the government. A lot of high-level government officials belonged to one of the mainline churches. Now, the Christian Century within the Protestant mainline was considered the most influential and prominent liberal Protestant publication. Prior to World War I, it was a Disciples of Christ publication, but after World War I, Charles Clayton Morrison wanted to make it an undenominational paper so that it could reach more people. He felt that it would help with circulation. It had a small circulation between 35 and 40,000 people during the time under study, but the people who subscribed to this paper were important. They were clergymen who, preached to hundreds of people every Sunday. They were very prominent clergymen like Reinhold Niebuhr and Harry Emerson Fosdick, that's just two of the very many liberal Protestant clergy who subscribed and contributed to this magazine, and political figures such as William Sweet, who was Franklin Roosevelt's director of public relations and former governor, I believe, of Colorado. Charles Clayton Morrison was also considered a very important person in the United States. He was in the who's who of influential and important Americans in 1928, and his obituary that was in the New York Times also spoke to his influence and his importance as the editor of the Christian Century. So this turns to: why are my research questions significant? How are they significant? Well, what and how editors chose to publish about the Holocaust conveyed meaning to the reader. If the stories were at the front of the paper, then that conveyed importance to the readers. If they were published consistently and often and in language that did not cast doubt, then people might believe it and advocate to help the Jews who were suffering in Europe. Editorial decisions also offer insight into how the editors themselves and the reporters might have viewed and interpreted the persecution and annihilation of the Jews. If it's buried in the paper, it indicates that perhaps that person was skeptical. And then we look into what led to the skepticism of that editor. Or if they even write about it skeptically, why were they skeptical? What led to these decisions? And that can help us to better understand what they thought about what was happening. And periodicals often do two things: they reflect the opinions and views of their readers, but they can influence the views and opinions of their readers. And what I mean by that is people subscribe to periodicals typically with which they agree. They read the news sources they agree with. However, there is some indication that the press can influence what people think. For example, in 1943, the press was really laying it on about what was happening to the Jews, which in turn led to public pressure on the government to do something about it. And so the government initiated the Bermuda Conference. Nothing came of it, but it showed what public pressure could do. And that is oftentimes attributed to the media putting pressure on the public. And also, these periodicals, like the Christian Century, have letters to the editors that provide valuable cultural and religious insight. How did the readers of the Christian Century interpret the events of the Holocaust? And how did they interact with the periodical's interpretation of those events? So, my key primary sources are obviously the Christian Century itself from 1914 to 1947. There's about 1,700 issues that I am reading through. And the reason I went back to World War I is because I wanted to see continuity and change. What were the editorial decisions that Charles Clayton Morrison made during World War I and concerning atrocity stories from World War I, and how did those influence his post-war beliefs and then influence the reporting in World War II? I'm also looking at sermons and books by Charles Clayton Morrison, such as Christianity and the Social Cultists, because he was big into the social gospel, and The Outlawry of War, because he was a pacifist. And then his unpublished autobiography as well are my main primary sources. This dissertation is a microhistory focusing on one Protestant periodical to better understand the broader Protestant response to the Holocaust. So understanding the cultural and religious response through this one Protestant periodical. It is also a qualitative textual analysis that will largely take place in online and physical archives. So the issues of the century from 1914 to 1929 are located on the Internet Archive. And then 1930 to 1947 is at the Library of Congress, and the autobiography is housed at Southern Illinois University, where I've been working with an archivist to gain access to that as well. There has been a sizable gap in the literature. Raphael Medoff, Sarah Pinnock, two Holocaust historians, have mentioned the gap in our understanding of the Protestant response to the Holocaust, including the Protestant media, and there has been no scholarly attention given to specific Protestant periodicals. The Christian Century has been included in broad overviews of the press, but not looked at very specifically. And because I've been looking at this periodical specifically, I have arrived at different conclusions and realized some short-sightedness of scholars that have looked at the Christian Century. For one, they did not analyze issues from World War I, which demonstrates some continuity in the reporting on how Charles Clayton Morrison made editorial decisions when reporting on World War I. A lot of it is theological, questioning the stories coming out of Europe. So that wasn't the questioning of stories coming out of Europe in World War II was really nothing new for the Christian Century. They did the same thing in World War I. They also failed to recognize Morrison's understanding of how atrocity stories indirectly contributed to World War II. He believed that the atrocity stories that ended up being false from World War I made it so that Germany could not get a fair and just peace in the Treaty of Versailles, leading to the rise of Hitler in World War II. And he wanted to be absolutely certain that his paper did not contribute to another unjust peace. He was also very committed to peace, and this is often overlooked. As co-founder of the American Committee for the Outlawry of War, he was present when the Kellogg-Briand Pact was signed in Europe, and so he wanted to avoid anything. He didn't want his paper to be responsible at all for dragging the world back into another war. Now, Deborah Lipstadt in her book is highly, highly critical of Charles Clayton Morrison. In her book, Beyond Belief, The American Press and the Coming of the Holocaust, she claimed that Morrison and the Christian Century were ambivalent to Jewish suffering. But in analyzing the reporting in 1943, after the Holocaust was verified by the United States State Department, there was no ambivalence. They reported consistently. They reported asking and wanting their readers to pressure the government for action to help and rescue the Jewish people. There was no ambivalence in their reporting. Scholars also failed to recognize that Morrison was skeptical about all atrocity stories coming from the war broadly, from the Pacific side and the European side. It wasn't just about the Jews, and they don't accurately represent his quasi-Zionist position. They represent him as being anti-Zionist and almost anti-Semitic, but he really wasn't. He was for a binational state and believed that Israel needed to exist, especially after the war when the Jews had nowhere to go. In the early years, the editors of the Christian Century also recognized that America had difficulties claiming the moral high ground. Editorials throughout 1942 to 43 addressed the issues of Jim Crow, lynchings, and Japanese incarceration. All of these things were not addressed in the earlier analyses of the Christian Century and are things that my dissertation is seeking to correct.